the central geopolitical drama is going to be the rivalry between the United States and China, and whether it can be managed or not. Because if it can't be managed, that is a very dangerous situation, because China is the first peer competitor the United States has had that is genuinely a peer competitor. You know, you look at the Soviet Union, at its peak, the Soviet Union was about 12% of global GDP. No one thought of it as an economic, technological powerhouse. Whereas China, you know, it is the greatest manufacturing country in the world right now. Its share of manufacturing, global manufacturing, is actually rising. It competes with America in science and technology. In fact, it produces more refereed articles in places like Nature than the United States does.
Has more robots than the rest of the world combined.
Exactly. 1 out of every 2 industrial robots is made in China. They deploy 10 times as many industrial robots as we do. So this is a real competitor. And if we don't get this right, both in terms of deterrence and in figuring out how to compete, we could spiral into war.
America is at an interesting moment. We are 1/4 through the 21st century, and in 2026 celebrate our 250th birthday. I'm asking a series of extraordinary Americans, many without fame or fortune, and coming from experience and reflection, to take the temperature of America in 2026. What is the American idea? What do we stand for? What values do we need to remind ourselves? How is this country doing politically, economically, culturally, and as a force for good around the world? Fareed Zakaria has spent decades explaining the forces shaping the modern world and America's place within it. He is the host of Fareed Zakaria GPS on CNN, a weekly international affairs program he has anchored since 2008. He writes a weekly foreign affairs column for the Washington Post. He previously served as managing editor of Foreign Affairs and as editor of Newsweek International. He is the author of 6 books, From Wealth to Power, The Unusual Origins of America's World Role, The Future of Freedom, The Post-American World, In Defense of a Liberal Education, 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World, An Age of Revolutions, Progress and Backlash from 1600 to the Present. Born in India, educated at Yale and Harvard, and shaped by the experience of becoming an American, he has spent his career thinking about how democracies function, how power is used, and how ideas shape the course of history. I am pleased to have him on this Zoom. Welcome, my friend.
Thank you so much, Charlie, and thank you for listing every single book title. That was very special.
Well, I find that sometimes people want to know what you wrote before the book that is now in paperback. I want to talk about 4 things. One is the book. There is much to talk about now that it's in paperback as well. I want to talk about the fact that Donald Trump is concluding 11 months in his second administration. I want to talk about a little bit about the 21st century. We are marking 25% through it, and America at 250. What do we need to remind ourselves, and how do we look going forward? But take a look at the history and tell me how it is that history led us to the populism that seems to be sweeping Europe and in a variation of it in America.
You know, when I was working on the book, I had no idea that I started the book before Trump, but I could see that there was developing around the world a kind of backlash. And what was it a backlash to? It was a backlash to the forces that had been unleashed in the late 1980s around the world. So the late 1980s, you think about it, what was happening was the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of communism, the opening up of markets and trade all over the world. People think about Eastern Europe, of course, being liberated from communism, but there was a whole story in Latin America. Almost every Latin American country in 1980 was a junta, was governed by a military dictatorship. By 1995, almost all were democracies. If you think about Africa, Africa held, I think, something like 45 elections in the 1990s. So there was this movement toward openness, openness economically, openness politically. Even if you think about the information revolution, it was a revolution of openness, connecting people, opening up information flows. And the world was moving so fast that one of the things I think many of us didn't appreciate was just how disorienting this was going to be for people, particularly people who were not surfing on top of these waves, who were being overwhelmed by these waves. And so everywhere in the world, I think what you've seen is some version or the other of a backlash. And the backlash has taken the form of, in a sense, reacting to the most visible form of these changes, which is immigration. Because, global trade flows, global capital flows, information revolution, these are all abstractions. And people don't know quite what it means. But immigration, that's tangible, right? That you see people come in and you think, and they look different and they sound different and they worship different gods. And so it's not an accident that everywhere immigration is the rocket fuel that is feeding right-wing populism. And so in a way, I think what we are seeing is, a kind of pattern that I talk about in the book that has been going on for 400 years. But I think that it's fair to say that my own sense is that if you put the information revolution plus the explosion of globalization, plus the cultural revolution, think about just the role of women changing in societies, in Western societies over the last 40 years, more than it's changed in 400 years. You put all that together, it's probably fair to say we went through the most heady, accelerated period of change and transformation. And so we're living through a very big backlash to it.
You point out a couple of things. One, you point out that revolution is often accompanied by technology, whether in the Nazi in Germany, it was radio. For John F. Kennedy, it was television.
Absolutely. There's always, information revolution, particularly in the last 200 or 300 years, has been a very powerful ingredient to accelerated change. Think about Gutenberg and the Bible and how it's Gutenberg's ability to print that took Martin Luther's message of rebellion against the Catholic Church and spread it around Europe so fast that the church was not able to stop it. Think about, as you say, in the 1920s and 30s, radio was this one-to-many broadcast system. And so if you think about coups in the 1930s, what people would always try to do is they'd try to go to the presidential palace, arrest the president, and they'd go to the radio station because they wanted the source of political power and the source of information power. Then it became the presidential palace and the TV station. Today, we are in a kind of networked world where anyone has the ability to broadcast to everyone. And so the whole process has been so thoroughly transformed and democratized that power no longer really rests with anyone. And that is now the kind of new revolution that we are dealing with, where everyone is empowered, and it produces polarization and virality. It produces the siloist stuff that we see, people picking their channels that they agree with. So each of these periods, you have seen information technology shape the politics of the age.
Yeah, it certainly was true from Mamdani winning the mayoralty in New York. It was true for Donald Trump.
Yeah, both of them, they seem very different, but they have one thing in common. They both are superb at using social media. Trump fundamentally at Twitter, because he's in some ways a little older, and so he uses a more traditional format, and Mamdani at Instagram and TikTok. Mamdani may be the most talented politician in America today at using social media. If you watch those videos, they are brilliant. They're simple, straight to camera. They're innovative. He goes to a halal cart and he talks about food inflation. He jumps in the water, in freezing water, when he talks about rent freeze, and he's always looking straight to the camera and talking to you, the viewer,
and smiling.
Somebody once said about politics exactly. If you can, somebody said it about Bill Clinton. In politics in America, you've got it made if you know how to do one thing. If you can fake authenticity, you've got it made. And Clinton had that ability. Mamdani has it too. I don't mean it in a disparaging way, but of course, he's not actually talking to you. It's a produced video. He's got cameramen around him. His mom is a movie director. This is all very, very thought through and conceived, but it looks authentic, effortless. He's looking at you, as you say. He's always smiling. He's always in a jacket and tie because he wants to be seen as serious and not too young. It's all a carefully cultivated image, and it's brilliantly done.
I want to talk about, as we talk about politics and moving from the election in 2016 to 2020 to 2024 and then 2025. But if you look at immigration as the most critical issue, in addition to the economy, give us a primer on immigration and how it has changed and become the issue, and why Democrats seem not to have been able to fashion a strategy.
I think it's not just Democrats, by the way, it's the left in general, because in Europe you have exactly the same problem. I think what most people don't understand is the scale of immigration and the shift that took place in the last 10 or 15 years. So if you look at America in 1970, about 4 to 5% of Americans in 1970 were foreign born. Today, that number is about 15%. So it's tripled over 40 or 50 years. If you look at European countries, that number goes from 2% in a place like Sweden in 1970 to 22% today. There's a huge increase, and particularly in countries which have not a long tradition of immigration and assimilation. So that's one part of it, which is there has been a very large, broad, secular rise in immigration across the Western world. The second and most important part, I think, that fed this current crisis. 20 years ago, when we thought about illegal immigration, we were talking about people furtively crossing the Mexican border, running away from the police, disappearing in the shadows, working in, chicken factories and construction work and agriculture, hoping nobody would check up on them. In the last 10 years, what has happened is people, when they cross the border, they don't run away from the police, they run to the police, because they have figured out that there is what I think of as fundamentally a kind of loophole in our immigration system, which is you can ask for asylum. You can ask for political asylum, and if you do, the laws are such in most Western societies that you immediately are taken care of. You're not deported, you're given a court hearing, you're then given a second court hearing, you have to be housed. And you remember all those scenes of people being put up in hotels. The reason was they had all claimed asylum. Now, I don't begrudge these people. They're coming and they're trying to figure out what's the way to try to come to America that has most chance to succeed. But it's fundamentally gaming the system, because the vast majority of these people are not actually asylum seekers in the sense that it was meant. The system of asylum was set up after World War II to try to, to bring a few thousand people who were persecuted because of their religion or political beliefs into the country. It was not meant to process 3-4 million people, which is what it's been doing over the last few years.
So what is a smart immigration policy?
I think we have to essentially cap the number of asylum seekers. It's currently open-ended. I think that in any society, any rich Western society, you can't say we're going to evaluate every single person who claims they seek asylum. And then if you have 5 million people, so be it. You have 5 million people sitting in your country for 10 years while you sort out these claims. I think you have to put a tight cap. I think it's got to be basically a few thousand people, maybe 10,000 people in a large country like the United States. Everybody else has to be treated as an illegal immigrant, that is, people coming in, through non-legal means. It sounds cruel, but it's important to understand, if you don't control your borders, you turn the entire immigration system into a game. You breed disrespect for the law, and ultimately, what I think you will do is you will lose the support you have in the public, particularly in America, for legal immigration. Right now, if you do look at the polling, Americans are very supportive of legal immigration. They're very unhappy with illegal immigration, with asylum seeking, all that. My fear is that if we don't fix that system, we are going to end up in a situation where it'll start bleeding over to legal immigration. And legal immigration has been one of the great sources of America's strength. About half of the tech companies in Silicon Valley are founded by immigrants.
Beyond immigration, what seems to fuel, and you have made reference to this, fuel political success are cultural issues rather than economic status.
Yeah, it's very interesting. People always say the economy is very important, but something very interesting has happened in the last 10 years. People don't look at economic data and formulate their political views. They formulate their political views and then read the economic data to conform to their political views. So what I mean is, when Donald Trump was elected in 2016, all the Democrats who felt the Obama economy had been doing wonderfully, you'd had the stock market more than double or triple, I think, in Obama's 8 years. All of a sudden, they felt the economy was terrible just because Donald Trump had been elected a few weeks earlier. And all the Republicans who thought the Obama economy had been terrible now thought the economy was great because Donald Trump had been elected. And the same thing happened in 2024. In 2024. So it tells you that people are now so polarized that they in effect read or misread the economy based on who's in charge. If their guy's in charge, the economy is great. If their guy's not in charge, it's not great. So what is fueling that polarization? And my sense is that the fundamental issues fueling polarization are these cultural issues: immigration, abortion, gay rights, multiculturalism, the so-called woke agenda. If you look at how Trump ran his campaign, his biggest issues that he hammered every day was immigration. Remember, he had that big chart showing the kind of massive spike in asylum. That chart, it was pointing to that chart that saved his life in the case of that assassination, because he turned to point to the chart, and it's a chart of asylum seeking, the rise of asylum seekers. And then he was relentless on the woke agenda. The ad that he ran that was most successful for his campaign was the ad which ended, Kamala Harris is for they, them. President Trump is for you. It was an ad against trans, athletes and things like that. So he is very clever and knows what ignites his base.
So why is his polling numbers falling? And why do people think that, he didn't do well in 2025? And they're suggesting in the House, Republicans may be in trouble.
So I can tell you what I think is going on, but you ask an interesting puzzle, which is not just why is he doing badly? Because you're right, his poll numbers are bad. He's underwater, meaning, the negatives outweigh the positives almost on every issue, including even immigration, because of the kind of brutality with which they've done some of the rounding up of people. To me, the puzzle is, given what you said, that he is, what he's doing is unpopular, why is he not course correcting? There's something very interesting. If you look at the speech he gave about inflation and affordability,
You mean last night?
yeah, vehement, defiant, not yielding, not course correcting on immigration, on any of these issues. So my theory, and it's the best theory I can come up with, is that Trump has decided Trump 2.0 is different from Trump 1.0. He's not constrained by the Republican establishment. He's not listening to those kinds of people. He's listening to his inner MAGA voice and to MAGA people like Steve Bannon and JD Vance and people like that. And they're telling him, stick with the base, cater to the base, fight back. Don't give in to all these Washington pundits and the Republican establishment, because the base will never leave you. And that is the heart of your success. Yeah, it's not, your approval ratings won't look great. But the thing is, if you have 38% of the public that is with you no matter what happens, that's a superpower. That's my guess of where he's going. And since he doesn't need to be reelected, maybe that strategy is, I'm going to ram through everything I want. And, the poll numbers won't look great, but my base will worship me.
But that's where he has some problems in your own area of most competence, which is foreign policy. There is difference within his base about foreign policy, about Ukraine, about Israel, about a role for America that has been traditional since World War II.
Yeah, you're seeing a very interesting series of splits in the party, in the MAGA movement, if you will, on Israel, on Ukraine, and on this broader question of America's role. But I think Trump has a good sense of where his base is, and I think he will manage to keep it intact. I have always been struck by the degree to which the more people move away from Trump, ultimately they get marginalized in the movement. Think of Marjorie Taylor Greene, right? She was the iconic MAGA congresswoman. The minute she broke with Trump, she realized that she had no future in the party. So I think, Tucker Carlson, after all, is a commentator. He doesn't need to be elected. But I tend to think that Trumpism is so much of a personality cult that I would think he will be able to get around many of these fissures, much more so than any other politician.
Do you think MAGA has a future beyond Donald Trump?
I think so. I think what's happened is
because it's populism.
Yeah, and the Republican Party has been reshaped. The Republican Party that you and I knew, Charlie, 20 years ago, was a party of, country club Republicans, Chamber of Commerce Republicans, mostly, kind of espousing free markets, free trade, cut the government deficit, fiscal conservatives, spread American democracy abroad, the Reagan formula, you could almost call it. None of those things apply anymore. It is now a working class party, working class base, mostly white working class, filled with a certain kind of economic populism and cultural resentments. Trump has been able to kind of play various sides of this, right? Because he's a businessman. He loves businessmen. He loves the idea of having all these rich people over. But I suspect the next guy after him is going to look more like JD Vance. And don't forget, JD Vance, in his core, is very skeptical of business. He praised Lena Khan as the FCC chair. He's talked about
you know what she's doing now.
Yeah, she's advising Mamdani.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So and by the way, Trump liked Mamdani. And that's again gets back to this idea of the populism. Trump is very clever. He knows when he sees a winner, and he goes. But I think you're likely to see MAGA outlive Trump because the Republican Party has been remade. The Paul Ryan Republican Party is dead. So even if Trump goes away, and it won't be, nobody will have the hold he has on the base. We have a different, working class party that is about a different, and that same thing, by the way, is true in Europe as well. Marine Le Pen's party is now a working class populist party. Nigel Farage's party is a working class populist party.
Influenced by Trump.
Very much influenced by Trump. I mean, Trump has had a big influence. Look at this guy in Chile who just got elected. He says, "I want to build a wall." Yeah, I want to build a wall in Chile. Have you ever seen how long Chile is? Good luck on building a wall.
When he says things like what he said about Rob Reiner, does it not make a difference? Does it not affect his own political success?
It puzzles me, honestly. I think that not only am I disappointed that people don't react more strongly, but I'm genuinely puzzled. Like, does anybody really think it's okay to talk like that, to tweet like that? And my only sense of way of making sense of it is, I think a lot of the people who support Trump don't like his manners, the crassness, the vulgarity, the punching people when they're down, but they like the fact that he's a fighter, and they are willing to excuse the occasional vulgarity, crudeness, obnoxious behavior, because they'd rather have a fighter. I think these are people who feel that their world has disappeared, they've been left behind, and the elites didn't notice and didn't pay attention to them. And here's this guy who fights for them. Okay, he's crude, he's vulgar, but at least he fights for them. That is my best rationalization, because of course my first reaction is, this is just gross. And I mean, it's beyond gross for the president of the United States to be tweeting like that.
Looking at the 21st century, it seems to me that there are at least four things, and I want to understand where we are on all of them. The rise of China, AI, populism, which we've been talking about, and also Al-Qaeda and ISIS, which we just saw raise its weaponry in Australia. What would you evaluate? How would you evaluate the American-China conflict, competition today?
I think you correctly focused. Of those four, I would say the central geopolitical drama is going to be the rivalry between the United States and China, and whether it can be managed or not. Because if it can't be managed, that is a very dangerous situation, because China is the first peer competitor the United States has had that is genuinely a peer competitor. You look at the Soviet Union. At its peak, the Soviet Union was about 12% of global GDP. No one thought of it as an economic, technological powerhouse. Whereas China, it is the greatest manufacturing country in the world right now. Its share of manufacturing, global manufacturing, is actually rising. It competes with America in science and technology. In fact, it produces more refereed articles in places like Nature than the United States does.
Has more robots than the rest of the world combined.
Exactly. 1 out of every 2 industrial robots is made in China. They deploy 10 times as many industrial robots as we do. So this is a real competitor. And if we don't get this right, both in terms of deterrence and in figuring out how to compete, we could spiral into war.
How are we doing in the competition, and where do you think that relationship is with respect to 2027, when Xi Jinping has talked about Taiwan?
So first, where are we in the competition? I think the United States has been doing remarkably well. If you think about the frontiers of technology, which are really clearly where you drive all the value now. I mean, these 7 companies are make up, I think, 80% of the stock market's gains in the last year was the gains in these 7 companies' stocks.
And they're the 7 tech companies we all know.
Exactly. Facebook,
Google and Microsoft
Nvidia,
and
exactly.
Facebook and their parent companies.
And we've been doing amazingly. We're doing amazingly in AI. We're doing amazingly in biotechnology, nanotechnology, now in quantum computing. The U.S. has done this remarkable thing, which is it has actually increased its lead against, say, Europe in the last 30 years. So 20 years ago, Eurozone economy and the US economy were the same size. We're now 50% larger than the Eurozone economy. 20 years ago, US and German wages were about the same. US wages are now 50% higher than German wages. So we've done an extraordinary thing. I mean, this is why the premise of MAGA is that, the US has been ravaged in these last 30 years. But actually, the data makes clear the US has expanded its lead against a lot of countries. China, the challenge is that even though they're on a per capita basis, they're a fourth as rich as we are. We're about $50,000 or $60,000 per capita GDP. China is about 15,000, but there are 4 times as many Chinese as Americans. So they produce more articles, scientific. They produce more engineers. They produce more engineering breakthroughs. They're doing remarkably well.
Not only that, they're also making sure that they are shifting some of their products from an export economy to a middle class that's developing in China.
Yep. They're doing it slowly, but surely. And the challenge then is, how do you deal with a country that's 1.5 billion and a peer competitor? So there is a way. The US is not going to be able to match China for all the things it does. We just don't have the capacity. And we're not at that stage. We can't take back, we're not going, textile manufacturing is not going to come back to the United States. We're not going to be able to assemble iPhones here. Those are these are low wage jobs. But we have this extraordinary thing. We have an ecosystem of allies that can, we could, a lot of the stuff that China does, that if we want to wean ourselves off dependence on China, India is a perfect place to get a whole bunch of stuff done. And that's not just theory. So 3 years ago, Apple decided it was going to try to shift some iPhone production to India. 3 years ago, Charlie. Today, India exports more iPhones, more smartphones to the US than China does. It exports 44% of all smartphones to the United States. China does only 25%. Every iPhone 17, the most recent version, every iPhone 17 on sale in the United States is made in India. That's in 3 years from a standing start. So there are ways, and then there's things you could get, work with Japan. There are things you could work with Australia, obviously Europe. But rather than thinking of how we could collaborate with our allies to create a kind of non-Chinese ecosystem, so we're not too dependent on China for raw materials, for chemicals. China has a 90% lock on penicillin, for example. Instead of working with our allies, we've declared trade war against our allies. We are punishing the very allies we should be working with and strengthening.
And in our strategic papers, we tend to dismiss Europe.
Europe is the enemy in many ways. It's an extraordinary that national.
So where does that come from and why?
So I think there are 2 or 3 things going on. One, the great threat for the Trump MAGA crowd is immigration. And they hate him. They don't like immigration and immigrants coming to America. And they hate the fact that they're coming to Europe. They're changing, these societies or that. And the second part is, I think they look at Europe and European politicians basically as Democrats. They think that Europe is full of Democrats. That's who runs Europe. That's who runs the European Union. And so it's kind of like domestic ideology reflected onto foreign policy. Because really, if you look at that national security strategy, the passion with which they describe the enemy, it's not China, it's not Russia, it's not Iran, it's not Al-Qaeda, barely gets a mention, Islamic terrorism. The passion is about these European societies, the immigrants and migrants who are wrecking America, wrecking Europe, and these supine Europeans who are allowing it to happen. It's an astonishing document that way.
But Trump can be, or can say with some success, that he's gotten the Europeans to pay more as a percentage of their GDP to their own defense. I'm asking rather than stating a fact. Is that true?
I think basically you're right. I think it's important to remember that original number, the 3% rule or whatever it was put in place under the Obama administration. And Bob Gates was Secretary of Defense. He's the one who came up with it and said Europeans have to meet a minimum
of 2%.
Of 2% of their GDP. And then Trump started to raise it. But Trump, to be fair, has forced them to do more. But how? He's forced them to do more by basically threatening them, blackmailing them,
imposing tariff,
putting tariffs on them, and essentially threatening to abandon Europe. I think that the thing about the Trump strategy is we are very powerful. You can always squeeze less powerful countries. But what the Americans for 80 years understood was we were building an international system not based on, single transactions where we could squeeze the other side for the best possible deal. We were building enduring relationships with like-minded democracies that would last for decades and decades. What Trump is doing is so short-sighted because every one of these countries is now searching for alternatives. The Canadians are trying to figure out how they can trade more with China and Europe. The Europeans are trying to figure out how they can trade more with Latin America and Southeast Asia.
And so are the Brazilians and everybody else.
Exactly. The Indians are now making nice with China and reestablishing and reaffirming their relations with Russia. So everyone is now trying to wean themselves off too much of a dependence on the US and actually hedge.
So the president of Ukraine faces a lot of pressure to sign a deal with Russia. They want him to promise that he will not join NATO. And they're promising that there will be a security understanding for him and his country. Should he trust that?
He shouldn't trust that. Remember, Ukraine had a security guarantee. It was called the Budapest Declaration, signed by Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom, guaranteeing Ukraine's borders in return
if in fact they would release their or transfer their nuclear arms.
Weapons. Exactly. They gave their nuclear weapons to Russia, and in return, those three countries, US, UK, and Russia, guaranteed their sovereignty and independence. So they've had one of these phony guarantees. Look.
So what does the president of Ukraine do?
It's a very difficult challenge because Trump is essentially abandoning Ukraine. I think it's already happened. Most people don't realize the flow of American arms, even though we're not paying for them anymore, the Europeans are paying. The flow has slowed to a trickle. They're not sending the most advanced weaponry like the ATACMS and all those kind of things, the Tomahawks. They are not doing as much intelligence sharing. What I hear from Ukraine on the ground is that they are slowly being abandoned by the Americans. This is devastating. So the challenge is, can Ukraine get the Europeans to give them enough wherewithal that they can continue to make something of a stand so they have a strong bargaining position? Of course, that we should be looking for a negotiated end to this war, but on terms that are reasonable.
And the Europeans have little choice but to support Ukraine because they worry that Poland may be next.
Yeah, but the problem is Europe has, the real peace dividend, Charlie, after the end of the Cold War took place in Europe. The Europeans essentially dismantled their entire, not just their militaries, but their entire military industrial infrastructure. So The German army in 1985, I think I've got these numbers right, was like 800,000. It's now 150, 200,000. It's about a quarter the size it used to be during the Cold War. The Germans had a huge military industrial base. It was all wound down. So they want to get back involved, but they've got to restart industries they've closed 30 years ago. They've got to restart companies. They've got to restart a supply chain of military hardware. It's not going to happen overnight. That's why what America is doing is so damaging, because there isn't an easy alternative. That's why the Europeans said, okay, we'll pay, but would you supply to Trump? And he sort of agreed, but as I say, in practice, that those supplies have slowed to a trickle. So the Ukrainians are in a very tough spot. And I think that he's going to have to make some kind of a deal. But here's what he's trying to avoid. What Putin is trying to do is to create circumstances where Ukraine turns into a basket case, totally dependent on Russia, and eventually becomes like Belarus or Georgia, one of these states in the near abroad of Russia that are essentially satellite states of the Russians. So how do you do that? You do that by having very weak security guarantees, because what that means is nobody is going to invest in Ukraine economically, right? Think about it, Charlie. If you're a businessman, are you going to build a factory in Ukraine if you think the Russians might march in 2 or 3 years? Unless there's ironclad guarantees and a big Ukrainian army that is well equipped, you're not going to take that risk, right? That's a huge political risk to take. So Putin wants to make sure that the shadow of Russian invasion always hangs over Ukraine. No one will invest in it.
Can Europe allow that to happen?
Well, they have to figure out how to stop it, right? Europe is rich, but it does not have the military wherewithal to really provide Ukraine with what it needs. So Ukraine is going to have to. I think it's very important that Ukraine have essentially the strongest army in Europe. I don't think it should agree to a limit of 600,000 troops, which is what Putin wants it to. I think they must get guarantees from the Europeans and the Americans. Those guarantees have to be pretty ironclad. They should have an Article 5-like trigger, which says an attack on Ukraine will produce an American response. If you don't have all that, Ukraine is going to become Belarus, and Russia will be poised to kind of.
Do you think the American negotiators think like you are talking?
I think that they have come to realize that it's not so easy. Trump came in this second time, and I think he had a strategy on Ukraine, and you could see it very clearly. It was, let's force Zelensky to make all the concessions. I'll take those concessions to Putin. These are all the things he wanted. We'll make a deal. Yep, some people will say that it's tough on the Ukrainians, but I'll say I ended the war and I'll win the Nobel Peace Prize. And he tried that strategy, and we saw him bully Zelensky. Zelensky eventually agreed to most of Trump's, and so he went to Russia with the Russians in Istanbul had asked for three things. We get to keep all the land we've conquered. Ukraine can never be a part of NATO, and there will never be American troops in Ukraine. Trump gave him all three at the start of the negotiation before even, it's very unusual to preemptively concede your adversary's demands before you.
Why doesn't that bother Americans, or does it?
I don't think it does. I mean, Americans subcontract foreign policy to the president, I think. But the fascinating thing is Putin said no in Alaska. So now Trump is genuinely, you can feel that he's kind of at a loss on his Ukraine strategy, because he thought he had a simple plan. Pressure the Ukrainians, get all the concessions, give them to Putin, and we'll get a deal. And now Putin says, I want more.
If Xi Jinping decides he wants to move on Taiwan, do you think he is likely to decide that? And do you think America and the rest of the world would respond?
He certainly can. The Chinese military for the last 20 years has been modernizing around a single strategic objective, which is to be able to take Taiwan. So I would not be surprised if their opinions vary on this, but my own view is, look, it's right next door to them. It's 11,000 miles away for us. I suspect that the Chinese military would be able to do something, probably at great cost. And, I think what deters Xi Jinping more than anything else is the fear that if he did that, he would be cut off from all the markets in Europe, Japan, and America that sustain China's economic growth and rising standard of living and sustain the Communist Party's legitimacy. So I think that the single thing that most keeps Xi Jinping from doing anything is that sense that China would get unlocked from the world economy. And unlike Russia, China very much needs the world economy. That is how China got rich, by selling into the world. I think that the second thing that deters him is the fear that the United States will get involved and make it a very complicated.
And so when he watches Ukraine, what decisions does he make?
Well, he's got to think that America is not, that the Trump administration is essentially conceiving of a world of spheres of influence where, Trump keeps saying, look, Russia is bigger. Why did Zelensky start this? Even though Zelensky didn't start it, what he means by that is you should be deferential to Russia because they're the big guy in the neighborhood, just like we're the big guy in the Western Hemisphere, right?
And so therefore we should be able to do whatever we want to do with respect to Venezuela.
Venezuela, exactly. And so Xi will logically draw the conclusion that that means he has room to maneuver in Taiwan. Now, will he take it? As I say, I think he would still worry about being cut off from being disintegrated from the world economy. And I think he would worry that depending on the nature of the event, the Americans might come to Taiwan's aid. My own view has always been that the Chinese will not do something as stupid as the Russians did in Ukraine in terms of a full-scale invasion. They will do a blockade. A blockade is much more effective because Taiwan, after 11 days, runs out of energy. Taiwan, it's this island with no resources and no energy. So, if you put a blockade in place and you just tell the oil tankers coming in, turn around, guys, you don't want to confront the Chinese Navy. Yeah. We know what will happen because it happened in the Gulf with the Houthis. All those ships lose their insurance immediately. No one is willing to insure them. So all those tankers will turn around and Taiwan will be strangled. And then we'll presumably have to make some accommodation with China. That is, I think, the Chinese strategy. And and it's a clever strategy because then to break the blockade, it's the United States that would have to initiate the use of force. It's the United States that would have to sink a Chinese ship. And that would be the first kinetic use of military power because the Chinese would just put their ships up there and radio signal to the oil tankers saying, don't come here, buddies.
There was a blockade of Berlin, I guess. And secondly, there was a blockade of Cuba.
This is very similar to the Cuba quarantine, exactly. Except this time it would be the Chinese doing it, yeah.
I mentioned also that it is the 250th birthday on July 4th, 2026. You have seen a lot. You have talked to a lot. How is this country doing when you look at its history, when you look at its role in post-World War II and as a liberal democracy?
At one level, the United States is the most dominant country in the history of the world. We are 4% of the world's population. We're 25% of the world economy. We're 50 to 60% of global financial markets. Every frontier technology is dominated by the United States. We have the biggest military in the world. So, at one level, you have to say the United States is doing extraordinarily well.
But is it declining? Is it less respected? Is it less depended on?
So
is somebody prepared, China, to step in the vacuum if it exists?
So this is the puzzle, the extraordinary thing. The United States is as dominant as I described. And so when you looked at it, you say, what could make the United States lose that place? The rise of China, the return of Russia, terrorism, things like that. No, what is causing America to retreat from the world is its own desire to retreat from the world. It is a self-inflicted wound.
Is that part of populism?
It is, I think. It is part of because in a sense, what America has done for the last 8 decades is to create an international system and sustain it, and be the guarantor of it, that has allowed for an open, rules-based world. And the American strategy was, we'll be fine. Enlightened self-interest is at work here because in this world, we'll be at the center. The dollar will be the reserve currency of the world. New York will be the financial capital of the world. LA will be the cultural capital of the world. And it all turned out to be true. But for the populists, this is a sense of we're bearing too many burdens. Why the hell should we be the ones who have to do all this stuff? And, so they want to shed those burdens.
Why should we give money to Argentina when we need it here? That kind of thing.
And by the way, why should we help the poorest people in the world? Which to me is tragic because we're the richest country in the history of the world. For 1% of the federal budget, we were saving tens of millions of lives in Africa.
This is USAID.
USAID. And to me, for a country that thinks of itself correctly as being in its DNA a Christian country, what is more Christian, than to honor the tenets of the New Testament and the Sermon on the Mount, which are all about helping the poor, the meek, the dispossessed, helping the strangers, right? So it's very sad that we have gone into this narrow, self-interested mold. But as I say, the most important consequence of it is we're losing sight of the fact that this world allowed the United States to be at the center. This world allowed the United States to prosper mightily. I mean, it still allows us to run these crazy deficits because the dollar is the reserve currency of the world. And so everyone still has to buy our debt. We get enormous benefits by being the global hegemon. And yet we're sort of, as I say, we're not losing it because of the rise of China or the return of Russia. We're losing it because we're throwing up the chess pieces in the sky.
Not only that, we're deeply divided. And so therefore, we're not getting things done on the agenda to be on an agenda for the future.
Yeah, and we're losing the kind of investments that we were making in science and technology. We've declared war on our leading universities. If there's one area...
Why is that? What is your assessment of why they declare? One friend of mine, a Nobel laureate, said, Charlie, it's not that Trump is against science. He's against... It's his own sense of being anti-elitism.
I think that's exactly it. It's a war on elites. It's almost like an American version of the Cultural Revolution, because the part of the MAGA populism is that over the last 3 or 4 decades, you had the rise of this smug, elite, meritocratic class that looks down on us, that games the system for themselves, and this is a kind of assault on that. And the tragedy is, what you're assaulting is, first of all, the seeds of economic growth, science, technology, basic research. But also, you're taking an area where the United States was totally dominant, which is higher education. We dominate that field like no other country in the world.
At some point, it was like 18 of the top 20 universities in the world.
Right. And now what's happening, I tell you, a friend of mine invests in a company in India, which helps Indians who get admissions to foreign universities with student loans. So I asked him, how's your business doing? He said, my business is up 20% this year. But the American part of the business, Indians going to America, is down 50%. And I said to him, do you think it's a blip? He said, no, because people are discovering the rest of the world. They're discovering that they could go to universities in Australia and in Canada and in Britain, and they're realizing that it's a third the price. It's a quarter the price. So we've done this to ourselves. We have helped people understand that American universities are crazily expensive. Until now, there was the halo effect. The American university was still better than any other. And so no matter which one you were going to, and it's a huge business for America. I can't remember the exact number, but I think we're talking about 40, $50 billion business a year. Americans attracting foreign students who come and pay full fees. That's all going away, and that influence that we have by educating the elite of the world is also going.
Well, you remember whoever it was first suggested this, that the thing we should do is staple a whatever visa card to a diploma to make sure that people like Fareed Zakaria stay in America after they get a first-class education.
Michael Bloomberg was the guy who suggested it. And then, in the usual bizarre way that Donald Trump is, he once said it as well.
No.
And so,
but then MAGA, as I understand, when he said it, there was some pushback.
There was a lot of pushback, and he's very clever on immigration issues. You'll notice he always listens to MAGA. On H-1Bs, he's essentially killing the H-1B program. And on that issue, he heard a lot from his corporate friends, against it, but he has stuck to the program by and large, because he knows that on immigration, he needs to stay with the MAGA base.
Part of what Americans were proud of is that they believed, and they may have been wrong in certain cases, that this country was admired for its moral stands, for its global morality. We didn't conquer countries. And does that still exist?
I think much less, because people have a feeling now that America doesn't like the world and doesn't wish other countries well.
Rather than being a friend of the world, we don't like the world.
We're trying to squeeze every one of these countries. Like we're saying, we want you to do badly. We want to win, and we want you to lose.
We want a portion of your economy.
Right. And I think you put it exactly right, Charlie. I've gotten a lot of criticism from the left about this, but I firmly believe the United States, as a great power, as a superpower, has been a force for good in the world. And my argument about it is very simple. You can compare the United States to, Mother Teresa or to St. Paul, or you can compare the United States to other great powers in human history. And so I say has the world been a better place because the United States won World War II rather than the Germans, rather than Hitler's Germany? Has the world been a better place because the United States won the Cold War rather than the Soviet Union? Has the world been a better place because the United States won the First World War rather than the Kaiser's Germany, right? If you compare the United States to other great powers that were dominating the world at the time, we have been better. We have thought about the interests of the world. We invented, this whole new international system that allowed the whole world to prosper. We invented the idea of foreign aid. We invented the idea of creating some global forum where countries can sit down and try to work out their differences peacefully. So I think that we have an extraordinary heritage and history to be proud of in our engagement in the world. But it was premised, as I say, on this enlightened self-interest, that we weren't trying to squeeze everybody and say, I can get a better deal by punishing your economy, by extracting tribute from you. By telling the Danes we're going to take Greenland from you, by telling the Canadians we're going to annex your country. That's old-fashioned imperialism.
Does that mean that as America marks its 250th birthday, there is nothing wrong with it that strong leadership cannot change?
No, because we are very divided as a society. We are, this
fundamentally divided.
Yeah, and this populism isn't going away. And there are a large part of the country which feels, I don't see what any of this world role gets from me. And it's not even just the world role. I don't see what these mechanisms of liberal democracy get for me. I'd rather have my guy run the country, smash all the checks and balances, do whatever he wants, violate all the ethics laws, ethics rules and things like that. That's it's fascinating how much anger and as I say, that's why I think this is really America's cultural revolution. There's a desire to tear down these old structures, and it's what's sad is these are structures that have served us very well. We're the oldest constitutional democracy in the world.
And immigration has served us very well.
We're a very unusual country in that we are a very young country, but a very old state. In other words, think about it. Egypt has been around since 4000 BC, but the current Egyptian government was founded by Nasser in the 1950s, 40s or 50s, right? The United States is a very young country, but it's a very old polity. Our constitutional democracy is basically older than anyone else's. Maybe Britain compares. So what that means is, we should be cherishing that heritage of continuous constitutional democratic rule that we have had since 1776 or 1789, depending on where you want to start it.
Does it mean also that there is something to the idea that America, all the way back in 1776, and based on your own history of the book Age of Revolutions, has taught you that America is an idea? It is not a place. It's an idea that we need to be reminded and that we need to serve.
So in the early part of the Republic...
Or am I naive?
No, the early part of the Republic, there was this writer. His name was Hector St. John de Crevecoeur, and he wrote a book called Letters from an American Farmer. And he asks, now this is I can't remember exactly, but it's the early years of the Republic. He says, what is this thing called an American? How can there be an American? Because some of these guys are French, some of them are German, some of them are Irish. They don't speak the same language. And then he says, what makes them American is that they all believe in this idea of being part of a liberal democracy. And he gets at that idea that America is fundamentally an idea. It's not a religion or an ethnicity. Or the European conception of nationalism was basically, we have all lived in these same forests for time immemorial. We've worshipped the same gods, and we've hung out here together, and that's why we are a nation, right? With the Germans, the French,
exactly.
Whatever.
Yes.
The American conception of nationalism is completely different. It is that we came together to create self-government for the first time.
Believing in certain ideals.
Right. We are, as Lincoln said, a nation dedicated to a proposition. And what Lincoln is hearkening back to is Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence, because he says, we are dedicated to a proposition that all men are created equal. So that is the founding idea of America. It always was this amalgam and hodgepodge of people of different ethnicities. People forget now, but the America First movement and the isolationists of the 20s and 30s, they were all very similar to this national security strategy. Don't get too involved in the rest of the world, and let's limit immigration, and let's not have all these unassimilable populations that are swarming into America. Of course, the unassimilable people in those days, Charlie, were the Italians, the Irish, Southern Europeans, and Jews, who seem to have assimilated very nicely into the American system. So we've always had this. Now, is it true that American culture was, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and that it owed a lot to British culture and it owed a lot to Christianity? Of course. And that still does inform America. Anyone who thinks otherwise is, crazy. I mean, walk down Fifth Avenue on Christmas and, look at the Rockefeller Center tree and, ask yourself, what does this society honor, venerate, and celebrate? It's Christmas, right? That's one of the defining aspects of America. But it is not an exclusionary idea. And it never has been an exclusionary idea because it was always bringing people who seem different. Like we don't think of, the Italians and Irish as so that different, but they were regarded as that. I mean, as you know, there were at times at which they were seen as almost blacks, and so there was always this sense that America was able to create out of this hodgepodge a new person.
Yeah. I can't say it any better than you did. I thank you for coming to this conversation about America. I thank you for all that you write. And I note that Age of Revolutions is now in paperback, and it looks at changes from 1600 to 2024 with an afterword that brings it up to date. I thank you very much. Pleasure to have you.
Charlie, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Fareed Zakaria.
Charlie Rose Global Conversations are long-form dialogues with remarkable men and women about their lives and the ideas that define us, and those from science and technology that change us. I'm looking forward to a future with wisdom from lessons learned, meaningful courage, authentic humility, and God's grace. I hope you're enjoying the conversations. Hearing from you helps. Please like and subscribe if you would like to be notified of future guests. Criticism and suggested guests, topics, and events are appreciated. You can mail us at the address below, Global Conversations 2025 at gmail.com. Join me, become a subscriber to Charlie Rose Global Conversations, and make it a better experience. Click this link to subscribe.